All right, guys, let's take this one step at a time. I know when you guys had the sub in class on Monday, she went over with you the conversions between fractions, decimals, ratios, and percents. She also gave you a sheet that kind of reminded you how to do all of those different conversions, and hopefully she went over each individual one with you. But that's what I'm here for right now. I'm going to do each individual one with you, and then we'll do some example problems to see how they will be listed on a test. So with those combined applications is really what they're called, because we're combining the decimals, the fractions, percents, and ratios. So taking a look at that, let's look at the first part of that sheet and how it tells us how to go from a fraction to a decimal. So the example that they give us on that sheet says, first, if I have 3/4, that's my fraction. If I want to convert that to a decimal, in order to do that, fraction to decimal is probably your easiest conversion, because you simply just take the top divided by the bottom. Use your calculator. Your calculator, if you took 3 divided by 4, it's going to spit out 0.75. So all you have to do is read it down. Read it as if it says 3, again, divided by 4. And if you just put that in your calculator that way, that's exactly what you're going to get, 0.75. Doing another one, if I had, say, 1/8. Okay, 1/8, we'll look at that as 1 divided by 8. Always, 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 guys, it's top divided by bottom. Not to be confused with 8 divided by 1, because that would be 8. That's backwards. We need to remember it's top divided by the bottom. So it has to be 1 divided by 8. When I do that in my calculator, it's going to spit out 0.125. So you have converted that fraction to a decimal. And that's it. That's all you have to do on that. Don't be thrown off if you ever have a whole number in front of that fraction. So we saw earlier that 3/4 is the same thing as 0.75. That 0 is in front of that 0.75 because there is nothing in front of that fraction. So 3/4 is the same thing as 0 and 3/4. But if I have 2 3/4, well, if my pen would write today, if I have 2 3/4, turning that into a decimal just changes it to 2.75. The 2, the whole number in front of our fraction, simply just replaces that 0. So you don't have to worry anything about that. Don't let that throw you off at all. Super, super easy. So if I have, let's say, 6 2/5, all I have to do is, again, because it's 6 2/5, I know it's going to be 6 point something, but because that fraction is 2/5, that's what I'm going to take and divide in my calculator. 2 divided by 5 is 0.4, or 0.4 in my calculator. So 6 2/5 is 6.4. So that's converting your fraction to a decimal. Super, super easy. That's all you have to do on that. The next conversion is a few more steps involved there, where you're taking a decimal and you want to convert that to a fraction. So the opposite conversion in that case. So let's say we have the decimal 0. Let's look at 0.2. If I have the decimal 0.2, the idea is, in order to turn this into a fraction, what I have to do is turn that into a whole number. So I want it to change from 0.2 to 2. And in order to do that, what I have to do is move my decimal as many times as I can to get it to the end. And in this particular case, I only have to move it one time. Moving it one time puts it behind the 2, and in that case, when that decimal is all the way on the far right, that makes it a whole number. That whole number is our numerator of our fraction. The denominator is based on that specific decimal movement. So because I only moved it one time, what happens here is denominators are actually going to be based on based on tens. Because when you move a decimal, you move it by an entire place value. So when you move by an entire place value, you move by 10. So if I move it once, my denominator is going to be 10. If I moved it twice, my denominator would be 100. 3 times would be 1,000. 4 times would be 10,000. 5 times would be 100,000, and so on and so forth. So what you noticed in that is that the more we move our decimal point, or the more we have to move that decimal point, the more zeros are going to be added in that case. So I always remember that the number of times I move my decimal is actually going to be the number of zeros in my denominator. So it's always going to be a 1 and so many zeros. So in this case, it's going to be a 1, and because I only moved it one time, 1 0. That's all I have to put there. So it's 2/10. But don't forget, fractions always have to be reduced. Both 2 and 10 can both be divided by 2. So when I do so, 2 divided by 2 is 1, 10 divided by 2 is 5. So 0.2, that's my decimal. That was the same thing as a fraction, 1/5. And don't forget, we know how to check our fractions. Again, because I know how to turn a fraction into a decimal, if I double check it, 1 divided by 5, if I were to put that in my calculator, it will absolutely spit out that 0.2. So that means we did it correctly. Okay, let's take a look at another one. Let's say instead of 0.2, let's say it was just, say, 0.25. Let me erase all this stuff first. Well, it's not letting me. Okay, so we have 0.25. Okay, sorry, I messed up. Technical issues sometimes. Okay, so 0.25. Now I've got 2 places I'm going to have to move it. So if I move it 2 places, that turns it into the whole number 25. Again, that 25 becomes my numerator, and my denominator was based on the number of times I move it. Again, there's always going to be a 1, and because I moved 2 decimal places, I'm going to have 2 zeros in my denominator. So 25 hundredths is my fraction. But is 25 hundredths reduced? No. 25 and 100 can both be divided by 25. You can divide them both by 5. If you did 5, you would get 5/20ths, which would reduce again to 1/4. So remember, reduce it all the way. Reduce it till you can't reduce any further. So continuing to move on. So let's remember when I told you guys on the last one, if we had a whole number in front of my fraction, that's actually going to be the whole number that's in front of my decimal when we were converting fractions to decimal. Same thing happens here. If I have a whole number in front of my decimal, so say I have let's say 45, just for good measure. Okay, if I have this as my decimal, don't be thrown off by that 5. That 5 is actually going to be what goes in front of my fraction. All I really have to look at is that 0.45. So I can look at it really a couple of different ways. Again, do the same thing. If I move my decimal as many times as I need to turn it to the end, that's going to give me the whole number 525. This is just one way that we can start with it, and I'm going to show you a different way that you can use it. So it's the whole number 525 over, again, because I moved it twice, 100. What this leaves me with, though, now is an improper fraction. That improper fraction, remember to reduce improper fractions, you look at it as 545 divided by 100. So looking at how many times 100 will go into 545, writing that down here at the bottom, 100 goes into 545 5 times with a remainder of 45. My denominator stays 100. So some people choose to skip this particular step, what I'm circling on here, because remember, like I mentioned, 5, if that's the number in front of my decimal, that's going to be the number in front of my fraction. So what I need to just look at, if I just look at that 0.45, I still have to move it 2 places to get to the end to turn my my numerator into 45, and my denominator is still 100. So I still get 5 and 45 hundredths if I do it that way. Totally up to you, though, if you want to use this first step. So, that being said, remember, fractions must be reduced. We always have to reduce. Remember that. And both 45 and 100 can both be reduced by 5. So because of that, 5 and 45 hundredths becomes 5. And then 45 divided by 5 is 9. 100 divided by 5 is 20. So it becomes 5 and 9/20ths. So that is how we are going to reduce those decimals, convert those decimals into fractions. I hope that helped with that. Moving on to the next conversion. Taking a proper fraction and converting that to a ratio. Now, fractions and ratios, the only thing you really need to know about fractions and ratios is that they're pretty much the exact same thing. So if I have the fraction 3/4, that's the same thing as the ratio 3 to 4. We just write them a little bit differently. The reason why sometimes we use ratios instead of fractions, if you guys recall from our fractions lecture, fractions represent a part to total relationship. So on the one you have on your screen there, 3 out of 4 something. So if I have, again, we kept using pizzas, so meaning I ate 3 out of the 4 total pieces of pizza. Or there are 3 apples out of the 4 total pieces of fruit in the fruit bowl. Whatever it may be, it's representing a part to total relationship. Usually ratios are a comparison relationship. So it shows that I have 3 pieces of pepperoni and 4 pieces of cheese. That there's a difference in the two numbers. But as far as converting one to the other, they just are written differently. They're the same thing. 3/4 is 3 to 4. Or 1/8 is 1 to 8. It's just your numerator is the first number, your denominator is the second number. Written the exact same way. As long as you have that reduced fraction, you have your ratio. So when I ask you to convert a fraction to a ratio, that's all you have to do is just pretty much rewrite it. But a ratio, because it's a comparison relationship, it's always 2 numbers. It will never be anything more than just 2 numbers. So if my fraction, so that's the next conversion on your all sheet, if my fraction happens to be 3 numbers, meaning it's a mixed number, if I have, say, 5 and 1/2, now I can't convert that. 1/2, yes, that would be 1 to 2, but because it's now 5 and 1/2, that's a little bit different. But we know very well how to convert a mixed number and change it to a number that's just 2 numbers. So meaning if I take that 5 times 2 plus 1, remember where we changed them into improper fractions, what that's going to do is it's going to change it to 11/2. We did that when we were multiplying and we were dividing fractions. We had to change them into put them in that numerator denominator form. But if you see here now, I'm left with just 2 numbers. 5 and 1/2 is the same thing as 11/2. But if I wanted to rewrite that as a ratio, we would just rewrite it as 11 to 2. So that's what we get there. So anytime you have a mixed number, all you have to do is make it improper in order to get your ratio. So doing just one more of those, if I had, say, 6 and 3/4, changing that to an improper fraction would be 6 times 4, which is 24, plus 3 is 27, and then 4 stays your denominator. So 27/4, just rewriting that to a ratio, is 27 to 4. So that's your fraction to ratio. Pretty easy. Once you have your fraction, you really can't get to your ratio unless you have your fraction first. The next conversions on your sheets are the decimal to percent and percent to decimal. Kind of the magic number to think about here when you're converting, anytime you're involving a percent, remember that percents are always out of 100. If I got, say, an 80% on a quiz, that means I got 80 out of 100. If I had 50% of something, it means I ate half of it because it's half of, I'm referring to food. If I ate 50% of something, then I had half of it because 50% is a half of 100. So that's what's happening here is that, that's where we're getting that magic number of 100. So with that being said, when I'm taking a decimal, if I have the decimal, say, 0.5, we know that 0.5, if we're thinking in terms of money, that's kind of the same thing as 50 cents, which we know 50 cents is exactly half of a dollar. So we know later that that's actually going to be the same thing as the fraction 1/2. We'll see this again. But if I want to convert this to a percent, what actually is happening when we're converting a decimal to a percent, technically, I'm going to multiply by 100. Why I say technically is because anytime we multiply by 100, it's easier to kind of think about it this way. Times 100, and you can check in your calculator to see, because this is what you'll see. Multiplying anything by 100 is the same thing as moving the decimal point 2 places to the right. You'll notice 0.5 times 100 in your calculator will give you 50. So 0.5 is 50%. If I have 0.75, multiplying that by 100 is the same thing as moving our decimal 2 places to the right. I don't know why this won't write for me today. 2 places to the right, which turns it into 75%. Decimal to percent, all you have to know is moving your decimal 2 places to the right. That's it, no matter what your decimal is. Even if your decimal is, say, something small. So say it's 0.003. Very, very small decimal, but moving that 2 places to the right, we only stop at 2. The only reason it's only twice is because we're only moving by 100 when converting it to a percent. Percents are only out of 100. So that's why we're not moving it to the end. So that moves it and it becomes 0.3%. So it's just a very, very, very small percent. And that's okay. So, you know, if I wanted to keep going, let's say if I have, I don't know, let's say I have 2.6. 2.6. Well, that's my decimal. If I wanted to change that to a percent, I move it 2 places to the right, and that becomes 260%. Always, always, always 2 places to the right every time you're converting a decimal to a percent. So I'll show you another way to remember that a little bit later as we get to that chart. So if a decimal to a percent is 2 places to the right, well, then a percent to a decimal is also just going to be the opposite conversion. Anytime you're given a percent, so say if I have 65% and I want to convert that to a decimal, I'm just going to go the opposite direction. This time it's going to be 2 places to the left. So 65 being a whole number, that means that the decimal is just right there, right behind the 5. You know, it's assumed to be right there because since there's not one in there, I'm going to take it and now move it 2 places to the left in order to get my my decimal, which is then going to be 0.65. And 0.65 would be the proper way to write that. But if you didn't put that 0 there, I'm not going to mark you wrong. In any case, if you have 7.3%, and I want to know what that is as a decimal, you've got to take this decimal, move it 2 places to the left. So this is actually going to be 0.073. So that's converting your percent to a decimal this time. So how these questions are going to be worded on your test is you're actually going to have, and I'll just create this up at the top here, you'll have a chart, and in this order is how it's going to be written. It's going to be decimal, let's see, how do you have it in your book? You have it as decimal, percent, and it won't let me write on this. Okay, here we go. Decimal, decimal, then fraction, then percent, then ratio. So let me space these out a little bit so we can, have them across the top. This is how they're going to be, listed. That's how they are on your homework assignment, and that's how they're going to be listed on a test too. So up here, this is our chart. So I'm just creating, a few examples here. So it's listed as a chart, just the same way it is in your book. What I'm going to do is I'm going to give you one of these 4 things, and then I want you to give me the other 3. So starting off with somewhat of an easy one that we started working on a little bit earlier, 0.5. If I gave you the decimal 0.5, I know 0.5 is the same thing as half. But I know that because, once again, I take that decimal. In order to convert a decimal to a fraction, I need to move my decimal point as many times as I can to get it to the very end. That, at first, turns it into the fraction 5/10. Because remember, I moved it 1 time, so there's only 1 0 in my denominator. Okay, so we have 5/10, but don't forget 5 and 10 can both be reduced by 5, so this reduces to 1/2. Again, if I wanted to double check, 1 divided by 2 does give me 0.5, so that's the correct fraction. So far, out of my answers, I have 1/2 as my fraction. So that's my answer. To get your percent, Okay, you can go in any order that you choose in any of these. You don't have to go in the same exact order that is listed, because in some cases you cannot go in that order. But knowing how we get to these things is just taking what you have and working with that. So if I wanted to go to my percent now, remember decimal to percent is how we're going to get our percent. So I move my decimal point this time at, at first the decimal to fraction was moving it just until I got to the end. So that's why I only moved it one time on that previous example. But to go from a decimal to a percent, we always have to move it twice because technically we're multiplying by 100. And we did this one a second ago. When we have 0.5, I'm going to take that and move it 2 places to the right, and that gives me 50%. So half of anything is 50%. So if our fraction is half, that's why our percent is 50. And then getting to our ratio comes from our fraction, and since our fraction was 1/2, our ratio is 1:2. We just rewrite it a little bit differently. So that's one example. Let's take a look at another one. So again, let's just draw that line back up there. This time, let's say I have a fraction. Let's say I give you the fraction 1/8. We have the fraction 1/8. Well, whatever's easier for you, do that one first. In my opinion, fraction to ratio is pretty easy. When I have that fraction 1/8, that means I have the ratio 1:8. I just want to make sure I put it in the appropriate spot as far as answer-wise. What else can I do with that fraction? Let's see. So the only things I have left are decimal and percent. And I really can't get my percent unless I have my fraction. Unless I have my decimal. So what I need is that fraction to get that decimal. Remember, if I take that fraction and take top divided by bottom, read it down and divide it as 1 divided by 8, then what I'll do in that calculator, when I do that, 1 divided by 8 gives me the decimal 0.125. So that's my decimal. And then now that's how I can get that percent, because decimal to percent, remember once again, is only 2 places to the right. So I get 12.5 as my percent. Okay, let's try another one. You guys are going to be sick of these. Okay, so let's say we start with the percent. So let's start with the percent, 4%, small percent. If I could write today. Okay, I'm going to do a couple things with the percent. In this case, 4%, I know how to go percent to decimal by taking that decimal point, which is assumed to be right here behind the 4, take it and move it 2 places to the left. That's going to give me the decimal 0.04. 0.04. I just cannot write today. 0.04. Okay, and then I can go from my decimal to my fraction, because if I have 0.04, remember, decimal to fraction is moving that decimal point as far right as you can to get it to the end and turn it into a whole number, that whole number being 4. That becomes my denominator. No, that becomes my numerator. Sorry, guys. And my denominator is based on those decimal movements. I moved it twice, so I'm going to have 2 zeros in my denominator, which makes complete sense because remember, percents are always out of 100, and my percent, my original percent in this question was 4%, which means I have 4 out of 100. Makes complete sense. So you could get it that from there as well. Usually that's only if the percent is a whole number is the easiest way you can do it that way. But that's either, no matter what, we can convert our decimal to a fraction, and that's how we did it. But is that fraction reduced? No. We can absolutely reduce that fraction. 4 and 100 can both be divided by 4. And 4 divided by 4 is 1. 100 divided by 4 is 25. So that gives me 1/25 as my fraction, and then 1 to 25 as my ratio. So that's how we're using these combined applications. We should be able to get, whatever we start with, we should be able to get the other the other 3 from that. Let's start with a ratio. Remember, ratios can be improper, so don't forget sometimes that if we have an improper ratio, we don't want to leave the fraction as improper. So let's say I have the ratio 27/5. no, sorry guys, not 27 fifths, that's not a ratio. 27 to 5, I just wrote it as a fraction. 27 to 5. Remember, ratios and fractions are the same thing. So yes, that does mean we have the fraction 27 fifths, but we're not finished because we don't want to leave ratio or fractions in improper form. So what I want to do is reduce this and see how many times will 5 go into 27. Doing this kind of quickly, it goes in 5 times because I know that 5 times 5 is 25. So I have a remainder of 2 and my denominator stays 5. So actually this is the fraction I'm looking for because we want to make sure we reduce it. So if that's my fraction, my decimal is going to come from that. Remember, fraction to decimal is just numerator divided by denominator. But if we have a whole number in front of that fraction, that's going to be the whole number in front of my decimal. So that's going to be 5 point something. I just have to take 2 divided by 5, and 2 divided by 5 is 0.4. So now I'm left with is my percent, and remember, decimal to percent is moving my decimal 2 places to the right. So that gives me 540%. So that's just a couple examples on those combined applications. I hope that helps you out with those and reminds you guys on what to study for the weekend. But if you have any questions on any of those, please, please, please let me know. You should also see a metrics video here shortly.